in my time in and around churches and meeting people and what have you, I have run into a lot of people, and myself included, that will talk about not attending church for a time because of a difficult situation, because of an argument or a church split, or something that's happened, and it's driven them away from church. And what I also find interesting is like what the support looks like for them. When you've had a difficult time at church, what do things look like? Like, does their pastor come to them and say, cheer up, you got to come back to church? Are they cast off? Do they get support from other churches through other friends? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what does it look like for people after a problem and they're trying to heal? And this was a process that I went through. Um, the the scripture that gets leaned on a lot is Hebrews 10 and 25. And it says, "Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near." So I'll give you my own history. And and I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible because this video is not really about me. What I'm trying to do here is be supportive and understanding. So I was a worship leader at a church for about 10 years, maybe a little less than 10 years. And within that 10 years, towards the end of it, I got involved with the board, which was a very large mistake. My personal character, my belief system, I'm very cut and dry, and I find it very hard to separate that. And the events that occurred while I was on the board at my church just didn't go well. And the truth is, I confess to you, is that I left that church wrong. I left it in anger. I didn't make my position clear. I I got really upset. I got really hot, and I left. Now, it's probably worth noting that the situation was very, very serious, and it did turn out that I was justified in being as upset and emotional as I was because of the way things happened later on down the road, but it still doesn't excuse how I left. So I left the church and I'm really, really upset. There was a lot of things that happened afterwards. There was a whole bunch of things that were said and accusations that were made afterwards. It was a typical smear campaign. And so I left and I basically said to God, like, I'm not interested in this and I'm not doing it again. So I spent about 2 years away from the church, and I was reeling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing in the church, and I was naive. I couldn't believe how I was treated. I couldn't believe like how all things panned out. But the sum total of it, folks, is that I was really, really hurt in this exchange. And so I spent some time away from church, and I was angry. Was I looking to go back to church? No, I was kind of pouting. Um, Not kind of. I was pouting. And anyway, a couple of years go by and an opportunity came up. Not an opportunity. some friends of ours had moved on from our old church to another church, and they were telling us how wonderful it was and all the rest of it. And I eventually wound up going. And again, the short version of the story is that I started attending there. I got involved with the worship team. I became the worship leader again. And guess what mistake I made a second time? I wound up on the board. So, about this time, after a lot of prayer and talking to my new pastor, he pointed out to me, you didn't really leave well your last church, and he suggested that I go back and just make good. He wasn't suggesting that I go back and reattend that church. Nothing. He said, if you really want to develop your character well, go back, make some apologies, get a couple of get some confessions underway. We weren't Catholic, but just kind of clear the emotional table. And I did. It wasn't too bad, because by then all the tempers had flared, had gone down, and there was forgiveness that was on the table. I mean, sometimes time is what's needed, right? So I did that. And then what I also did was I told God that I wasn't going to leave a church like that again. I wouldn't leave in anger, and I would leave well. And so we spent, all told, about 3 years at this new church. But after the first year and a half at the new church, some things went really, really wrong again. And I won't go into the gory details of what happens, but I found myself in a situation that was horrible. I found that I was in over my head with this. The church board, the leadership is what they called it, didn't want to hold meetings to deal with the problem that was going on. They wanted to do everything via email, which is wrong. And it was the kind of situation where there was 8 members of this board were all firing off emails, right? And so when you're kind of in this situation where an email comes in and you feel like that you can contribute to this, and you're typing, and as you're typing, 3 and 4 emails are being fired across the bow, and now you realize that what you've been typing is now completely irrelevant because of the other arguments that have been created, and you're trying to play catch up. And I was getting frustrated, and I was getting full of anxiety. It got to the point where I couldn't eat. My stomach had just twisted, and one of the people that was in the mess was a really good friend of mine, a man who was my mentor, who has been a father figure. And it was a situation where I was getting so upset in the midst of all this. I literally wanted to get violent with the people that were accosting him. And I was getting angrier and angrier and more depressed and more anxious, and I wasn't sleeping, and I had my own business at the time, and I'm trying to handle all this stuff. And I remember my customer at the time was listening to my phone going off, like bing, 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 bing. And this was all emails that was getting chucked out. And I'm finding myself sinking. Emotionally, I'm sinking. And I finally decided to sit down and say, like, I got to figure this out because, like, who's right, who's wrong? Am I right? Am I wrong? I honestly didn't know. This thing was unfolding so fast that you couldn't you couldn't process it. And it became obvious to me that there were a lot of conversations that were happening outside of our email meetings, and a lot of things were being discussed in other conversations, so that I wasn't being included on, and it was horrible. And so I finally sat down and I said to God, I said, you need to help me through this because I am not a great Bible student. I'm not a theologian. I am a guy that reads my Bible topically, meaning something comes up in conversation about the book of Job. Now my interest is piqued, and I'm going to dive into the book of Job, and I'm going to chase this topic down, and I'm going to get a better understanding of how to answer this question. I'm not somebody that can sit down and just read the Bible like a book. It's very hard for me. I never was a good student in school. I am the kind of person that learns visually. And so, but I said to God, like, you've got to help me with this. And so he said, okay, well, here's your topic: how to deal with an argument biblically. Okay. And so that's what I did. And I sat down and I'm reading, I'm researching. I was very, very grateful for a website called gotquestions.org. They just seemed to nail all of my questions. And I'm not one for following somebody else's narrative or following their explanation on something, hook, line, and sinker. I'll take the scripture references and then go back, read them myself, and then start processing things for myself. So I sat down and I did this, and it was over the course of about 3 or 4 days. What I decided to do was to respond to everybody on my board with Bible chapter and verse, and respond to them in order to get this exchange to stop and let us handle it properly as Christians and as board members. We're supposed to be handling this in a professional manner. And I sat down and I'm right and I'm typing and I'm proud of what I'm doing because I'm learning a lot. And at the end of it, I read and reread and read and corrected, and I got my grammar right, and I double checked my scripture references. I got this right. And I'm expecting, boy, this is going to just slam the brakes on this problem right now. This is going to stop. And we're going to get this problem fixed like right now. And I sent the email off, and the emails stopped. I was in shock. And then an hour later, the emails picked right up and continued on again, assaulting my friend, my mentor. And I remember sitting back and I said, wait a minute. They didn't even want to hear the truth. They didn't want to hear or read or even acknowledge, not that everything I said was right. I'm not perfect. I'm not going to claim to be. I am at best a buffoon that tries really hard. But I knew that there were good points that I had made about handling this situation properly. And the nutshell of it was that We should have held a meeting and handled this face to face as a board, and not hurling the accusations and the derogatory comments and the verbal assaults and the backroom conversations. All that should have stopped, and we should have handled this professionally in a room. But nobody wanted to do that. Everybody was, they're just, I mean, everybody's brave when they're behind a keyboard, right? And now I'm realizing in this moment that they don't want to hear reason. They don't want to handle this right. They don't want to handle it in a biblical manner. I want to handle it right. I want to handle it in a biblical manner. I was more than willing to hear logical and constructive complaints about my good friend, and I would be willing to hear them, but I wasn't going to listen to these keyboard cowboy character assassinations that had no backup and no substance, right? So the whole thing spiraled out of control, and then there was another couple that got involved. They created a bigger mess. They had a ministry. Their ministry created a bigger mess, and it just felt like there was this explosion of conflict that was going on in our church, and that the bigger it got and the worse it got and the more threatening it got, the less people on the board wanted to handle it. And it finally culminated into a large portion of our board quitting. And my wife and I, we stuck it out for a little bit longer, but we made it known that we are not doing this anymore. And we decided to put in our notice as opposed to quitting, and we gave them 6 weeks. And it might not have been perfect, but they were very clear as to what we were doing and what our needs were at the time. But when I left there, it was a long story. I appreciate you hanging on. But when I left there, I realized that emotionally I was destroyed. It had affected my body, it affected my mind, it affected my decision making. There was a sense in which I use this terminology with a lot of respect, but there was a sense in which I felt like I'd been violated and manipulated after all this went on. And after we left the church, the next Sunday, when I didn't have to lead worship and I didn't have to go to that church, it was arguably the greatest Sunday of my life. I walked away from this mess and I didn't need to handle it anymore. So then I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to deal with this, and then I really do want to get back to church. I want to get going back to church again. But what I started to realize in my own psychology was I was having a hard time letting things go. And what I started to see is I would go to a church and listen to a sermon, and I'd be sitting there in the pew with my arms folded. I'm bunched up like this, and I'm looking at the pastor, and I'm listening to the pastor, and I'm convinced that this pastor has no conviction behind his sermon, and that everything he's talking about was nonsense and crap, and that there was no way that you could apply this to real life. And basically what had happened is everything that I had experienced now turned into a lens. And the lens color was brown. Okay. And so what really happened is I did not, after these two bad experiences, I did not believe in pastoral leadership because I was convinced in my mind that most of these pastors were of a do as I say, not as I do methodology. because I did start to see things. I did hear legitimate things. You know, we went to one church, and this pastor, all he could talk about was fake grace. And I sat there in that pew, and the only thing I could take from that was that most of what this guy was saying, you could not prove scripturally. Therefore, it was personal conjecture and opinion. And I would get angrier and angrier and angrier, and so we would move on to another church, and the same thing would happen. And so this went on for about 4 years, and it went on. So we left that second church in September of 2019. And so 2020 rolls around, which is COVID, and everything is changing anyway. And everybody had opinions about COVID and churches, which I am not going into in this video. But it really caused us to examine things and to listen to it. And it just seemed that there was no way that another pastor was going to get through to me, at least not yet. What I needed was healing. That was what I needed. I needed somebody to listen to me, give me good fatherly advice, and get healed. But I didn't get that, because I would make the mistake of telling other pastors about what had happened. And of course, that scripture, Hebrews 10 and 25 would come up. Well, you know, the Bible says you're supposed to go to church, and you really need to be a part of the church. You got to go and attend church, and you got to get enriched by the church. And the only way that you're going to get through this is through the church. And I'm thinking, well, I still don't understand how you can say that, because the church is what wounded me. The church is what hurt me. I needed to heal. And it was about a year or so into COVID. Some things happened, and my wife and we needed to make a big move, and we moved to another province. And at the same time, a family member of mine was involved in a brand new church plant. And I thought, well, Lord, this has got to be a sign from you, because here we are in the midst of a move. And my family member's starting this church plant, so we're going to go to this church, and we're going to support him, and everything is going to be great. This is awesome. Like, going to church with family and the whole bit. No. You learn stuff. And I learned that just because a family member opens up a church does not necessarily mean that you're going to find your peace with church. Because at the core of it, the church is still there. The governance is still there. The teaching is still there. It's all still there. Just the faces change. So we tried this for about a year, I guess. And going there was, I'll equate it to trying to put on a jacket that's wet and too small. You're trying to get the jacket to sit right. You're trying to get it to drape off your shoulders right, but it's not, because it's wet and it's sticky and it's pulling and it's heavy, but it's still too small, so you're constricted. And that's what it's like. There's no peace. There's no being settled when you're in that position. And I remember finally, and I remember praying, and I said to God, listen, I need help. I want to go back to church. And it was my genuine want. And I think that's one of the major takeaways when you leave a church and you leave in the midst of a battle, in the midst of something bad, in the midst of something negative. Put it in your head that you are going back to church because it is a good place. There are good people. There are things to benefit. You can make good friends. You can make new friends. Going to the potluck or to the movie nights or to the breakfast, you know what I mean? There are good aspects of the church. But in my case, I realized that I'm looking at everything through those brown colored lenses. But what I think really happened is God knew that I wasn't going to do well in these situations. I believe that God, I shouldn't say I believe, because that can possibly cast doubt. God knew what was going on in my brain. He knew. He knew how I was going to react to Pastor 1 or Pastor 2 or Pastor 3 or my family member. He knew how I was going to react. And he knew the kind of relationship that I was going to need from a pastor to get through it. And so after this period of time with my family member, I just said to my wife, like, I'm done. You know, we did what we could. I did my best to help out. I joined the sound crew, which I said I was never going to do again. I was never going to volunteer at a church again, ever. I'm never going to give my time up. And I did everything that I could. And I said to my wife, you know, I'm done here. I'm finished. I don't like this. I'm not comfortable with the type of teaching that's going on. I'm not comfortable with the denomination. Just different teaching than what I'm used to. I'm not criticizing. I wasn't comfortable. I needed something that was a bit more familiar. And so we left, packed it in. I told my family member, just not working for me. I was honest with them. And so we waited, and I prayed, and I just said, God, like, can you provide the church? I don't want to be hopping around. I'm done with the hopping around. I need you to pave the way. And we heard about this church. I'd never been there, didn't even know where it was. I just kept hearing the name of this church in our town. And I remember waking up one day and I said, Chris, what about this church? Have you heard anything about it? Yeah, well, I've heard Chris, that's my wife's name. Yeah, I've heard the name, don't know anything about it, but everybody knows the name of this place. Okay, well, let's go check it out. And I remember her saying, like, well, I didn't think we were going to do this again. And I said to her, I said, well, I did. Yep, you're right. I said, but let's just try this one. And what God had done was he put the pastor, he finally prepared me for a very specific pastor, a really unique pastor. Very cool. And he put me in touch with this guy, and it's the kind of relationship with a pastor that I appreciate, because this guy he won't sugarcoat anything. You know, if you've got a cold and he's going to give you some Buckley's mixture, you're not getting a spoonful of honey chaser. No, you're just getting the Buckley's mixture. You choke it down, because the truth is the truth, and that's all you're getting. We're not dipping this in sugar. And that is a character trait that I absolutely love, because when you walk away from your conversation with him, you know exactly where you stand, right? And that's the kind of pastor that I needed and that I still need. He's a pastor that encourages, gives you a little push into the area that he believes that you would like to go, but he's not going to drag you out, kicking and screaming. He'll give you opportunities. And he's very clear. I remember one of my first conversations with him was about how people expect things out of their pastor. And he was very clear to me. He says he will be your friend. He will come and visit and talk and chat. And he is a really warm pastor. But one thing he is not, and he's very clear about that, is a counselor. So a lot of pastors will try and fake it through situations where they need to be a counselor. And don't get me wrong, there are some pastors that are in fact fantastic counselors. But some of them are not, and some of them try and fake it. And this guy is not like that. He will tell you very, very clearly that I will give you biblical advice if you're in crisis. I will take you through the scriptures that you need in your crisis. But if you need a counselor, you need to find somebody who is a professional counselor. Very direct. And just over the course of the past, it's 1.5 or 2 years that we've been going to this church, probably closer to 1.5 years. I came to see that God prepared a way to this pastor. I exhausted all other opportunities, but this was the pastor that I needed, and I needed to go on a journey of inner healing before I could even get to this pastor. So this was a very long video to finally get to my point. Don't let anyone push you into going back to church if you've had an issue. I am the first one to recognize and support the fact that you may have gone through, or you did go through, a major and serious wounding issue, fight, war, battle at a church. I'm the first one, and I will support you in it. But don't resolve that you're never going to go back. Because now what's going to happen is you're going to get cheated if you do that. Set it out in your mind and in your prayers that, God, I am going to go back, but I need to go back well. I need to go back so that I can participate. I can accept the teaching. I can become a contributing member of the congregation. And God will open those doors, and He will know when the best time is. But keep your radar on high alert. If my wife and I hadn't have acted on the going to this church, then I'd still be without a pastor, and I would still be without a friend. It truly didn't take long for this guy to turn into a genuine friend. somebody that I can lean on when I want to lean on. And he has actually leaned on me in some situations, and I've been very grateful to be in that position. Keep your radar on. Don't let anybody force you back too soon. Don't go back to church in guilt, but go back well. Anyway, I'm very grateful that you have hung out and listened to me blather on this. I hope it's of some value. Thank you.